right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our latest interview and AMA at BlockSpaces. I'm John Ruggie. I'm here with my co-host Drew Thompson again today. We're going to be talking about all things decentralization. Now, I can guarantee that if you're here, you've probably heard the term probably dozens of times already. But decentralization, it's one of those concepts that, depending on who you ask, it's defined a little bit differently. So today, we're going to try to get to the bottom of that, or at least, help you get a better understanding and a better handle on what decentralization actually means and why it matters if you're building in the Web3 space. That's why we've got Chuck Dyer with us. Chuck is our Chief Cloud Officer at BlockSpaces, which means he's pretty deeply involved in the Web3 infrastructure layer where decentralization, or maybe the lack of it, actually happens. And he's also someone who spent a lot of time building a more, traditional cloud infrastructure as well with the enterprise. So Chuck, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get any further, can you just share with us a little bit more about your background and what you're working on right now?
I started my IT career back in the late 80s, early 90s in the Marine Corps. Got a lot of my initial kind of computer introductions through my father, who was a professor at Ohio State University, worked in their computer science department. So I grew up around them. For the past over 30 years now, I've been working in mostly cloud infrastructure, running large data centers, building out large data centers. For the last 10 years or so, I've been really focused on research and development around AI, around blockchain. Worked for a number of companies, both in the Midwest as well as down here in Florida. I've been with BlockSpaces now for the last just a little over 3 years now, and really enjoying it.
All right, well, let's get into decentralization a bit further. Chuck, why don't we start with just your working definition of what decentralization is? That'll give us a good framework and foundation for the rest of our conversation today.
The first thing I want to do is make sure we set the stage between decentralization and distributed systems, because I think when we talk about infrastructure and cloud infrastructure, distributed systems has been around for a long time. As more and more systems have gone to the internet, it's really kind of focused on distributing that system or that application geographically to be as close to the customer as possible. Now, that's very different than decentralization. When I look at my definition of decentralizations, it's really about distributing the nodes in a manner that allows for the diversification of not only providers, but geographies, but the operators of those nodes, that no more than one entity has the controlling interest of more than 10% of that. So when we talk about blockchain, a blockchain can only be decentralized if no one provider has control of the entire blockchain. Otherwise, it's just another centralized system. And there's a lot of ramifications for that on both sides.
Decentralization is meant to have like a use case and solve a problem. Can you kind of walk us through the problems that you noticed with computer systems kind of growing up and how decentralization sort of attacks that?
I mean, the biggest part of decentralization is trust. And one of the challenges that you have with centralized systems is the owner of that data is in control of that data. I know one of the biggest things when we're talking about blockchain specifically is really financial data. When you have a single owner of that system, the owner has control of that. They can make changes to it, they can make modifications to it, and the end user doesn't have really any say in that. So as things have evolved over time, we've gone to where more and more people want to have that control placed in their hands regarding their privacy, their control, how they're able to use the data, what data they're actually able to put out there, and how they can interact with that data with other people without overreaching regulation.
So you've been in the tech space for a while. How long has decentralization been a concept?
I guess you could look at the advent of the internet. When the internet started, I think was probably one of the first technology-related decentralization projects, because there is really no one entity that owns the internet or controls the internet. You have a lot of providers, ISPs, data center providers, telecommunications providers that all make up the internet, and they each have regulatory things that they control within their area or their purview. But from a decentralization perspective, the internet gave the average person anywhere in the world the ability to log in, put data out there, and have it be available to anyone anywhere in the world at any time. So I think from technology speak, that was probably one of the first major consumer-based decentralization efforts that are out there. I think it has evolved certainly over time with the advent of blockchain and bringing blockchain in. Certainly Bitcoin being kind of this first cryptocurrency and this first dive into kind of decentralized money or the concept of current digital currency and the importance of decentralization to be able to make that work effectively. Because again, if the problem you're trying to solve is there's no governmental or no organizational control over that, and that is in the hands of the individual consumer, then only a truly decentralized environment or platform can exist to be able to support that effect.
So you mentioned some of the challenges, well, some of the benefits that could come from the user side when things are decentralized. So what are the things that come to your mind that really illustrate why decentralization might be needed in certain contexts?
I mean, I think since the advent of the internet, we have seen newspaper reports and articles about hacks and data breaches and anything that has a centralized owner of it. And I think the most appropriate one recently is FTX. When you're using a centralized platform, those funds and those things that you're trading do not belong directly to you. They're not in your direct control. So if there's anything nefarious going on, or they have a data breach, or they have a hack, or they have anything that happens within that organization, that data or that currency or whatever it may be is gone. It's out of your control. Blockchain adds an additional layer of security in a truly decentralized way, if it's done appropriately, to be able to mitigate a lot of those security concerns or those breach type concerns.
So if I didn't know anything about decentralization, I might say something like, well, that sounds really great because maybe there's a reduced risk of data being stolen or compromised. Decentralization in practice, like not every situation needs decentralization. Most companies still use a centralized approach. Even like you said, crypto exchanges are using a centralized approach to a degree. So walk us through like why decentralization hasn't happened sooner or why it's not happening.
Decentralization is hard. I mean, there's so many pieces to decentralization that most people don't think about. You know, decentralization is really made up of a bunch of concepts. It's made up of privacy, censorship, security, transparency. So in order to truly decentralize, there are a lot of things that have to go into that, specifically around blockchain. First off, you have infrastructure diversity, meaning that a blockchain can't run in a single cloud, in a single region, in a single data center, because the risks of anything happening to those central providers risks that entire chain, the security and vulnerability of that change. You also have the governance model of it. Chains that are run by organizations, you know, most people look at Ethereum as a decentralized protocol. It's not. Ethereum is run by the company. They do the centralized development. They put it out there. You know, you also have consensus diversity and distribution, because depending on whether you're proof of work or proof of stake, you could have more than that 66% of the network being controlled by large entities or organizations, which we see a lot of today because people stake through central exchanges. You know, that's where a lot of the staking power comes from. So when you look at, you know, FTXs and the Binances and the Krakens of the world, they make a large percentage of stake power, where that stake power, because it's done through a pool, that's taken away from the individual to be part of that consensus or governance mechanism. So if you wanted to do something nefarious, all you have to do is get enough stake power to be able to change something, and you can manipulate data then if you have that control over it. The other thing from a decentralization perspective is organizations that control that and what type of regulations they have through governments, through the countries in which they operate in. So for example, if you have chains that are running out of the US and you have the SEC file some type of a subpoena for them to block a wallet address or to back out a transaction or to reverse different things like that, that then doesn't fall into the model of true decentralization of that protocol if it can go in and be manipulated by a central organization.
Because you mentioned Ethereum, you mentioned certain issues. Can you kind of walk us through what proof of stake means?
Proof of stake means that you own a certain amount of that protocol, that token, whatever it is, and you're putting that token up as collateral to be able to prove that the transactions you're writing to the blockchain or to the ledger are valid. And if you don't write valid transactions, you'll be slashed, meaning you'll lose those tokens as part of a punishment for not playing nicely within the protocol. Proof of stake, proof of work, both have their pros and cons, obviously. Proof of stake is challenging, especially for new protocols, because a lot of times the price of the token is very low. It allows large scale investors or high net worth individual investors to go buy a lot of it and have a lot of it to be able to stake, which which in the end is good for the protocol because you need to have a certain percentage of it staked anyway. But for the security and privacy and censorship of it, then you have basically the concentration of the stake between just a few individuals or institutional entities that can control the change to that blockchain. So making sure that part of decentralization, especially in proof of stake, is that the stake is distributed appropriately. I know that's really hard to do because, you want to be able to have as many people doing it as possible. But the reality of it is a lot of the new protocols have very high concentrations of small numbers of investors that have very large stakes that could impact that early on in its development life cycle.
What's closest to being fully decentralized today?
Like I said, I think Bitcoin is probably the closest to being as decentralized as a protocol can be. The challenge is every Web3 protocol that comes out, they really have to look and see what is the utility of that protocol. And that should really kind of determine whether or not it should be regulated as a security or whether it's just a utility token that does some function or it serves a functional purpose. And I think it's really important that when protocol projects start out, they really kind of take a look at what are the requirements for privacy, for censorship, for security, for transparency, and what things are important to them for that protocol. They really have to know what the protocol is going to be used for before they go out and develop it. Because once you set these things in motion, it's very hard to stop that. It's like the boulder going downhill. You're not gonna stop it halfway down. So you really got to put the thought into that. And depending upon what your use case is, if privacy is the most important or if censorship is most important, then how you choose proof of work, proof of stake, how you divvy out and how you allow people to stake to that could be different depending upon which of those things are most important to your specific use cases. When you look at enterprise businesses that want to take advantage of blockchain and what they're doing, most of them will probably initially be using blockchain in a very centralized way. If you look at a lot of the enterprise solutions that are out there for blockchain today, they mostly focus on Hyperledger Fabric. They mostly focus on, they're going to run their own nodes. It's not really multiple companies. Now, when you get into consortiums, even consortiums are going to be centralized for the most part because usually the consortium or the trade group will run that chain, and they'll allow consortium members to participate in that chain. But they're still very centralized because the consortium still has to be the governing body for that. Just like a lot of the protocols use DAOs to be able to have this kind of separate organization to be able to manage them.
So if someone's like just getting into Web3 or is curious about it, what would be like the underlying message you would want them to approach the space with?
I'm always kind of the opinion that, what I earn should be mine. The government should keep their hands out of it. They have no business knowing, how much I make, what I spend my money on, I'll pay my taxes, whatever it happens to be like that. But the challenge is today is anything decentralized is not very consumer friendly. Now, centralized, it is. You can sign up for a Coinbase account with an email address and you can buy Bitcoin in 5 minutes. But again, that's centralized. That responsibility for the maintaining of that Bitcoin, its private keys, where it exists, that's not inherently yours. If you purchase, if you spend, if you trade, if you make money, Coinbase and other centralized providers are going to report that to the government. In order to philosophically move to a decentralized environment, you have to inherently take that responsibility on and be willing to live with anything that you do to yourself that was not right. That's the caveat.
Yeah, you touched on something a minute ago too that's kind of important, is like unbanked populations. It's interesting because especially in regards to Bitcoin, I know like Cardano, I think, is doing something like this too, like African populations, Middle Eastern populations that are sort of like, as you said, unbanked. Where do you see the role in decentralization in helping those parts of the world out?
There was a great TED Talk a while back that I watched, and it was talking about the impact of cryptocurrency on remittances around the world. And they threw out a number. I think I'm pulling this out of thin air, but I think it was last year when they did that. The amount of money that was in remittance fees was like $556 billion a year.
In the fees?
Just in fees. It's an astronomical number because a lot of these countries where they do these remittance, they take, up to 30-40% on the dollar for the money that's being transferred in. And these are the unbanked populations, they're cash economies. I mean, they don't have bank accounts. All they can do is keep, the coin or the paper money or whatever in their wallet. And that's all they have to be able to walk around. So if you're a person, you have a family of 5 and you're in Afghanistan and the Taliban runs you out, and you come back 3 years later to your property and somebody else is living there, how do you say, well, that's mine? Where's your contract? Where's your proof, your deed? All of these types of things, they don't have access to any of those types of things. So being able to use blockchain to be able to come into these countries and be able to, make it something as simple as can be on a mobile phone or a mobile device, then they have access to the same types of DeFi products that Europe and the US and Australia and countries have access to without, governments being able to manipulate their currency or the exchange rates or, anything like that. Plus, it's extremely inexpensive. If somebody wanted to send money from here to a family in Syria, they could, send $100 for a penny or whatever it may be, as opposed to, $50 or whatever they may charge in remittance fees through Western Union or whatever service that they're using.
Just want to share a couple updates with you all related to BlockSpaces. So, first of all, we just recently launched public Web3 endpoints, Web3 infrastructure, which you can get to on our website. So what that means, if you need a node for your project for, let's say, Polygon, Ethereum, Binance, whatever protocol your Web3 project is based on, you can get access to a free endpoint through BlockSpaces. There's no registration required. You don't need to sign up. You don't need a wallet. Just go to blockspaces.com. And then we have at the top of our menu, you'll see developers. Under that, it says free endpoints. So take a look at that. We've got over 30 endpoints available now. So be sure to check that out. The other update I wanted to share with you all is that if you go to that page that I just mentioned, you'll find, like I said, over 30 protocols. And sometimes finding the right one for your project can be a little bit of a chore as well. So we wanted to make that process a little bit easier for you as well. So when I say we, Drew actually built most of this himself. So thank you, Drew. But Drew built a Web3 protocol tracker that breaks down key details on some of the major protocols out there. So go to that same developers menu, look for a Web3 protocol tracker, and you can access that free resource. And if there's something that you want to add or something that you would like to update, we've got a link in there to send us a submission as well. So just a couple of things that we thought you all might find useful, and please go check those out when you have the chance. Rosa asked, what's that?
I know Rosa.
You know her. I think we all might know her. Rosa asked, do you think the Tradelens project failed because it was so difficult for the partners to participate? What's your take on that, Chuck?
I would definitely have to agree with that. Obviously, the biggest challenge with any of the logistics where you have multi-party involved in that really comes down to the adoption by the parties in that. Again, Food Trust, Tradelens are all kind of consortium based. IBM was trying to get a large population of these customers that are part of this whole logistics supply chain to come together. And when you have so many of these different providers with so many different inherent systems that they use, so many different applications, they may not be able to integrate into this blockchain system that they have inherently, or it may cost them a lot of money, or they may have to pull in a developer that they're going to pay a high dollar amount for. The integration into these systems, especially for small kind of mom and pop people that are along that supply chain, can be very expensive and very difficult for them to do. And I know that's something blockchain or BlockSpaces is trying to solve with our platform. So we want to try and make adoption not only for those types of products, but for any types of products as easily integratable into Web 2 systems as possible, to where you don't need to have a bunch of developers. Again, we want to be able to make that transition between whatever system you're using and whatever blockchain you want to use to make those things talk correctly.
Chuck, if someone wants to get in touch with you to follow up further, what's the best way for them to do that?
Feel free to hit me on my LinkedIn. It's Charles A. Dyer on LinkedIn.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate all your insight. Appreciate all your thoughtfulness and what you shared about decentralization. Other than that, thank you, Chuck, and thank you all for being here. We will see you next time.
Thanks.
Thanks.